Hello, everyone. After a long break, welcome back to Financially Yours. Today's guest is someone who has spent years examining how democracies respond when they are put under real pressure. Stephen Macedo, co-author of COVID's Wake and professor at Princeton University, joins me to talk about the choices nations made during the pandemic and why those choices differ dramatically. I came across this book through The Economist, which highlighted COVID's wake in its August 2025 issue. In the book, Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee question the sweeping non-pharmaceutical interventions adopted during COVID-19, from lockdowns and school closures to mass testing. They argue that many of these measures lacked clear evidence and departed sharply from pre-existing Western plans for respiratory viruses. I'll be putting these questions directly to Professor Macedo in today's conversation. Okay, hi, Stephen. Welcome to my podcast. So your book just came out less than a year ago. How has been the feedback so far, especially given that just a couple of years ago, writing anything challenging COVID-19 narrative was far from commonplace?
Well, it still is surprisingly far from commonplace given the number of controversies. We sort of expected that there would be more books out by now, but there are a few. There's the David Zweig book, which is very good, An Abundance of Caution. But the reception has generally been quite good. Actually, we just heard that it's on the Wall Street Journal's top 10 books of the year. Yeah, no, we were very lucky, I think, as far as that goes. And it's I think for the most part, the reception has been good. Some of our colleagues have not engaged as much as perhaps we might think, given the scale of the crisis and the biggest global crisis since World War II. But in general, the reception of the book has been quite good, I would say.
Your book argues that the global COVID-19 policies departed from pre-existing pandemic plans.
Yes.
So what do you think went wrong in the early global response?
Well, it's still a bit of a puzzle. I mean, we tell the story as best we can, but as you say, there were decades of pre-COVID pandemic planning documents, and there's differences of opinion, but the dominant theme, we think, is skepticism about the evidence underlying, the effectiveness of non-pharmaceutical interventions, and emphatic warnings that these measures would be very costly and that those costs needed to be communicated to the public in advance of them being implemented. So, November 2019, just a few months before the COVID pandemic, the World Health Organization's document expressed skepticism and said there were certain measures that were not recommended under any circumstances, no matter how severe the pandemic. And that included border closures, contact tracing, quarantine of exposed individuals. So, they'll say the other thing about those pre-COVID pandemic planning documents is they were quite canny in some ways, pointing out that there was a danger in that the politicians might have an incentive to implement these measures to show they were in charge, to demonstrate, a vigorous response that is for political reasons, not for sound public health reasons. So I think that's part of what happened. So, in terms of why were these documents ignored in the event, there's no question that the China model had an influence. The World Health Organization sent a team.
How did China influence the whole world?
It's rather astonishing. I mean, the World Health Organization sent a team there for a week. They spent just a little over a week there. They issued a report immediately afterwards. Of course, they were there under the control of the Chinese authorities, having access to what they were allowed to have access to and then not. And the report they issued reads like an award citation. They recommend that every country in the world should adopt the Chinese strategy.
Contrary to their previous reports.
Yeah.
World Health Organization.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, they said it can work anywhere, what the Chinese have done, and certainly paid no attention to the cost of the measures or any of those kinds of things. And then there was, of course, the Report 9 that came out of Imperial College London by one of the mathematical modelers, Neil M. Ferguson, warning that the headline was that without the implementation of a whole suite of these non-pharmaceutical restrictions on movement and so on, there would be 500,000 dead in the UK by August 2020, and 2.2 million in the United States. So there were some nuances in the report, but that was the headline, and it seemed to be intended to be the headline. And so, that was the day that the Trump administration had a news conference and recommended. And then I think the other factor was Italy imposed the first national lockdown in March, and it sort of demonstrated that a Western public was prepared to go along with that kind of measure, and indeed that it was popular. And then there was a kind of cascade and herd effect of states around Europe and the West adopting the same measures, which were, popular, being called for. The publics wanted these very tough measures to be implemented. So, there were a lot of dissenters in March. We chronicle them in the book. Some major public health leaders in the United States pushed back at first. Dr. Fauci in I think it was February 2020 said, the sort of thing that China's doing has never really been tried before. In the past, quarantines have not been effective. We're not sure they're getting good advice. There were others. Tom Frieden, former CDC director, said, we must consider the costs of these measures, which might be far worse than COVID itself. Michael Osterholm, the University of Minnesota, said people are just following each other off the edge of a cliff because they're not thinking as governments instituted these very severe measures. So there was a lot of pushback at first, and then it just seemed to go away once a kind of
One of them just changed their minds, right?
well, they changed their minds, or they decided that that the most sensible thing was for everyone to go along with the dominant policy. It seems like in April and May, a wartime mentality was expressed, that everyone needs to be on the same page, that this is the chosen strategy, and that we need unity behind these measures. Certainly, it was a shift in policy of a major sort.
What made us change our minds globally?
Well, I think it's complicated. I think another factor besides those I've mentioned is that, as compared with 20, 30 years before, a lot of commerce had migrated online, and many elites, like the two of us right now, were able to work from their laptops or computers. So there was the possibility for many, by no means all, of course, but many workers to work remotely. Many elites in particular, members of the laptop class, as it's sometimes referred to, were able to work remotely. And that was simply a possibility that was not available before. So I think that played a role as well. There was fear and there was panic. There's no question. So I think it's a combination of things.
Okay.
I'll say one other thing in the United States is that 2020 was an election year.
Okay,
By June, the reopening position became associated with Donald Trump, and I think progressive elites didn't want to provide cede any quarter to anything that he was supporting. They were terrified that he'd be reelected. And so, I think opposition to reopening, became a partisan issue, certainly by June, and then over the course of the summer and heading into the fall. So I think it's complicated.
It's a combination of all, probably.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Sweden was the one outlier, and they in a way stuck to their pre-COVID pandemic plans.
So they didn't close the schools. They didn't impose
Right.
heavy restrictions.
Right.
So what do you think Sweden ultimately teaches us about the trade-offs between MPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, and the costs, or even the democracy, maybe?
Yeah, well, I mean, they did have some higher mortality rates early on. They kind of anticipated that. The reasons, again, were complicated. They had a light flu season the year before, whereas some of the other Nordic countries had heavier flu seasons. So one theory is, and one observation that's been made is there may have been more vulnerable people in Sweden early on, but by within a year, their excess rates of mortality had equalized to those of other Nordic countries, and across the whole of the pandemic, by the best measures available, study by Pizzato et al. From Milan, Sweden had, across all of the states of Europe, the 29 states of Europe, the lowest excess mortality rates across the whole pandemic. And as you say, they never closed schools, except in a few cases briefly for kids under 16. their economy did take a hit because they're heavily export dependent, and the shutdowns in the global economy, of course, made a difference. But they relied much more on there was voluntary measures, of course. People did socially distance somewhat, but uh, they did well, and certainly were not predicted to early on in the COVID pandemic. We also examined the variations across the 50 states in the United States. There was quite a wide variation there as well. And there's just no evidence that the more stringent lockdown measures succeeded in reducing mortality significantly. So it's very hard to show at this point that these very costly measures had a measurable
GDP,
impact.
by the way, their GDP was bad in 2020. Their growth rate was the worst among the Scandinavian, but and
Yeah,
then they quickly recovered in 2021, 2022, 2023.
yeah,
They are by far
yeah,
doing good compared to their
yeah.
Nordic neighbors.
Yes, yes,
So yeah, let's zoom into in on the states. So you write that laboratories of democracy failed to produce a consensus on pandemic management. So how and why did states diverge so widely? Maybe you might also point to the red and blue state issue after
yeah.
that.
Yeah, well, it's early on, school closures and other measures, restrictions were adopted across the whole country, basically. There were a few holdouts in places of Wyoming and so on. But Ohio, which was a Republican governor there, was the first state, I think, to implement statewide school closures. And the early lockdowns in March heading into April were very widespread. The variation was in reopening. Republican states reopened faster, systematically faster, and stayed open. In the fall, virtually all schools in Republican states had reopened, whereas most schools in Democratic states remained closed. California schools remained
Hmm.
closed throughout most of the 2021 school year. So there was a huge, very, very significant divergence on partisan lines in terms of the length and the frequency of lockdown measures. And we just show that on graphs. The higher the percentage vote for Biden in 2016, the more stringent the measures that were imposed. So that's that very strong systematic relationship, and yet we don't find any relationship between the length of closures, all restrictions, school closures, the whole bevy of non-pharmaceutical interventions, restrictions, lockdown measures. There's just no relationship between them that we can find across the states and mortality rates. So it just doesn't appear that they were effective at reducing mortality. There is some evidence of somewhat reduced transmission of the virus, and there are many people who push back and argue, well, that must have had an effect. That must have also reduced mortality. But it's very hard to show that, and it may be that somewhat reduced transmission, it's not radical, but somewhat reduced transmission of the virus was well enough to make a significant difference over the longer term, and also was not enough to protect the vulnerable who needed more human contact. So, again, very early on in some of those pre-COVID pandemic planning documents, Institute of Medicine letter from 2006, they raised the question whether reduced infection rates were enough to justify these very costly measures. And that question still needs to be asked. There's simply an absence of evidence. We don't claim to have proven that the non-pharmaceutical measures didn't have any positive impact, but there's an absence of evidence to show that they did have a positive impact.
I interviewed with Bob Maranto. He was saying that I think he referred to a paper by Harry Patrinos. The longer the schools are closed, the higher the learning loss across the whole globe.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
even though there is no evidence that school closures prevent the infection, there is
Right.
strong evidence that school closures led to a learning loss across the whole
Yes.
globe.
Yes. No, I'm sure he's right about that. I don't know that specific paper, and I will look it up. I think he mentioned that to me recently also. But yes, there's no question. I think chronic absentee rates are now at about a third across the United States in schools. The impact was greater on minority and poor communities, as was predicted in the pre-COVID pandemic planning documents. The American Civil Liberties Union put out a document in 2008 warning against mandatory lockdown measures. It was a response to some of these mathematically modeled plans.
Did they say anything during the COVID?
They said absolutely nothing during COVID, completely silent during COVID, but a very eloquent and emphatic warning about the dangers in 2008 of wedding law enforcement and public health, and remarkably completely silent during COVID. The authors of that 2008 document are all still active at Boston University School of Law and School of Public Health, and for whatever reason they were completely silent during COVID. So yeah, some kind of remarkable turnaround for many people pre-COVID and COVID. And it's anyway, I don't feel as though we fully understand it, but I think the reasons are among those that I laid out, plus strong association of partisanship, that the lockdowns became associated with scientific establishment, public health establishment, and Democratic states, and the contrary position became associated with Republican states.
Like you already said this, but let's a little bit
Yeah,
like elaborate it. So you are saying that before vaccines, red and blue states has similar mortality rates, even though they implemented totally different policy. Like one of them
that's
was very stringent, blue states, red states, not at all. But at the end of the day,
yeah.
you are saying that their mortality rates is more or less the same.
Yes, of course, that you correct for percentages, of people that are uninsured, percentage urban. My co-author is a very good empirical scholar, so she includes all the controls that any social scientist would recognize have
Francis
to be
Lee, right?
controlled across the states. Yes. So, controlling for age, distributions across the states and so on. So once you've done that, right, no differences in mortality before the vaccines became available. Then once the vaccines became available and vaccine uptake was higher in Democratic states, the rate of mortality did trend
Change,
upward
okay. So
in
vaccine changed
Republican
everything.
states.
Okay.
Yeah, so the
So
vaccines were a game changer in terms of mortality. No evidence of effectiveness of the non-pharmaceutical interventions
okay, fantastic.
pre-vaccine. Yeah.
Any state surprised you for better or worse?
I think Colorado may have been, a Democratic governor there, but it was this kind of purple state. I think they may have been less had less stringent lockdowns. Someplace California was one of the most stringent. They kept their schools closed very long. So the basic thing was partisanship. In Florida,
It was very
DeSantis.
interesting in your book. That's one of the main takeaways for me. Like so strong partisanship
Yeah,
during the COVID-19, and even
yeah,
they are still elected after COVID, like
yes,
after the
yes,
elections. In whatever they
yes.
did, they are still elected again. Like right?
Yes, yeah. So that's the failure of laboratories of democracy. You would think that for learning to take place, there should not just be variation in policy and then variation in outcome, or a failure for costly measures to vindicate themselves in terms of better outcomes, but there should be learning from that. There should be uptake from that, and there should be a political accountability. And yet there wasn't. Governors got reelected across the states who pursued wildly different policies. So in that respect, the laboratories of democracies failed. Though the results are actually sort of revealing as far as we're concerned. I think part of the aim of the book is not just to analyze what happened during COVID, but also to use it as a window onto the state of our democracy. And a big part of the argument of the book is that there are institutions within our democracy that whose justifications includes universities, science journalism in general. Their justification is to be the truth-seeking parts of the democracy. Professors are given tenure, the benefit of tenure. Universities are subsidized by the government in part to be put in a position to be able to pursue the truth on these questions. And we just find that again these partisan dispositions and orientations undermine their truth-seeking function, and that's still happening, I think, to some extent, to some considerable extent. I think questions aren't being asked about these measures. People aren't open to the sorts of questions you're asking as much as they should be, because it looks embarrassing from the standpoint of the progressive side of the spectrum.
So let's widen the lens beyond the US.
Yeah.
So there's a popular claim that authoritarian countries like China handled COVID better because they could act quickly. Does that story hold up? What do you think?
Well, it's hard to say. Once they did start to open, they had tremendous number of COVID cases. So I don't think the policies, we don't know what the Chinese people thought of them, but there was tremendous amount of protest against China's lockdown policies. I visited over there, and when you ask students, graduate students, people in their 20s or 30s about, what life was like, their faces freeze over in sort of horror to remember back, at times when they're locked into their houses and not sure they had enough food or water. I mean, it was quite horrific, I think, for people. So, um, uh, uh, I think that my guess is if you were to survey the public, they would be very unhappy with the way things were dealt with. I mean, the claim is that they did manage to suppress it. I mean, if you lock people, into their homes, that may have an effect, but at what cost? I mean, part of the problem here is that even among those that argue that there were some marginal benefits to completely closing countries off. New Zealand didn't reopen its borders fully for 2 years and 5 months, after the beginning of the COVID pandemic, at tremendous cost. So trying to figure out whether the cost of these measures were anything like worth the could justify these measures. It's something that people haven't been willing to ask. So uh, I think again, China was able to deploy very severe restrictions on people's movements through surveillance apps and so on, and lots of cameras, and also to quarantine people and to lock them into quarantine places if they were exposed or tested positive. So tremendous power was exercised there. And I have a hard time looking at the Chinese story and seeing it as a model to be replicated in the future. Yeah,
So, okay, yes, the death rate was low, but at what cost? So
yeah.
I
I
think
mean,
that should be the question, right?
yes, and we know there's a lot of uncertainty around the numbers coming out of China, of course. To some degree, people have relied upon satellite imagery showing much more activity around hospitals than was being reported, or more
Oh,
activity around morgues and so on.
okay, let me borrow a question that you ask in the book. So, what is the proper role for experts in a democracy?
The line that's been repeated many times, it's associated with Churchill, but I think it may have predated him, was that experts should be on tap but not on top. That political leaders are the ones who are responsible for weighing expert advice in the context of their responsibility for the entire public good. For balancing costs and benefits, for thinking about risks, and expertise tends to be narrow. It tends to be associated with particular slices of relevant aspects of policies. Um, uh, Public health experts, epidemiologists, and so on are not expert on the costs of these measures, how to balance costs about benefits. They're certainly not experts on how to think about weighing people's basic rights, to go to church or to visit a sick relative or to visit a nursing home, or to balance the questions of value in life, of maintaining life's human contact with others and being able to celebrate significant events against some risks associated with a virus or a new pandemic. So experts should be in advisory capacity, should be offering their perspectives. A wide variety of them should be, but it should be political leaders who are making the decisions. Now, in the event of a crisis, of course, a lot of times political leaders don't want to take responsibility, and they're happy to evade responsibility and say, "Well, I'm just following the science. I'm doing what the experts have told me." There was a lot of that going on too, for sure. I mean, Dr. Fauci was seen as the anti-Trump, the trusted authority as compared with the president. So there was a lot of that going on, and there was some, Governor DeSantis in Florida did bring in various experts, including Dr. Bhattacharya from Stanford and Sunitra Gupta, I believe, and he actually read some of the papers and so on, and had a YouTube kind of panel with them, and then made the decision to require the schools in Florida to be open. He might have paid a political price for that. Florida has a large elderly population, and
Oh,
if
yeah.
if that had not been successful, he would have paid a political price for it. But it appears to be the correct call. And Sweden too, obviously the public health officials there. Again, they were deferred to some extent by the political leaders.
Yeah, it's different in Sweden.
They had overreacted to a previous a virus, and so they may have helped to be learned from that experience. But they did say, we quote them in the book, Johann Giesecke, who was a previous public health leader there and advisor during COVID, did say we'll take some extra risk for the sake of our grandchildren, for the sake of not imposing these costs on our grandchildren. So he did seem to look at it. They did seem to look at it from the broad perspective of the public good, rather than just doing everything conceivable to try to limit the
Point
spread of
connecting
disease.
to grandchildren. I have another question connecting to this grandchildren issue. So you write that none of the COVID-19 expenditures were paid by the new revenue. Quote, the entire cost of the pandemic response was added to the public debt, unquote.
Yeah.
So why is this problematic here?
Well, I mean, it means it may have to be paid by future generations. I mean,
Right, right.
it's added tremendously to the public debt. I mean, as a percentage of gross domestic product in 2020, we spent on COVID, and only 10% of the expenditures went towards public health measures. 90% of it was paying people's rent, giving them income support. In other words, supporting the lockdown measures, not directly combating the disease. 90% of it, well, another 10% went to waste and fraud and so on, but only 10% went to public health. But as a percentage of GDP in 2020, it was the equivalent of the entire New Deal in the 1930s, 5 years of the New Deal, plus the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. And then in 2021, as a percentage of GDP, it was the New Deal all over again, the entire New Deal all over again as a percentage of GDP. So it was a tremendous amount of money that was expended, and relatively small amount of it was to pursue the vaccines and to engage in other public health measures. A lot of it was for income support and
So according to a chart from your book, federal debt held by the public exceeded 100% during the COVID. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was a very large increase, and could probably contributed to the inflation that has affected countries in subsequent years. And of course, that led to governments around the world falling, as in the United States, because of the inflation that very likely these expenditures contributed to.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, let's end this conversation by looking forward instead of backwards.
yeah,
So fast forward to 2035, another pandemic looms.
yeah.
So what single reform, institutional, cultural, or scientific, would you think that make the biggest difference in how we respond?
Well, I think being much more open to dissent and disagreement, and recognizing the importance of dissent and disagreement. Um, it appears that public health in particular, though I think this has become true of science and journalism and elite institutions in general, but public health in particular uh, tends to view its role as providing sort of clear and emphatic guidance to the public, putting the public on notice as to what they ought to do, and not always providing a balanced account of risks and doubts and uncertainties associated with policy recommendations. So I think there needs to be much more clarity about the doubts around evidence, humility about the lack of evidence, or the lack of certainty on many policy recommendations, and then much more openness, institutionalized, to revising policies, to continuing to discuss and debate them in a way, a much greater adherence to the fundamental values of science and liberalism, which is openness to dissent and respecting minority viewpoints rather than suppressing them.
Are you optimistic?
Well, am I optimistic? Well, not particularly. Our politics remains deeply polarized, affectively polarized. There's mutual loathing on both parts of the political spectrum. And I think that infects the performance of science, journalism, science journalism, universities as well. So I do think that we have to try and bridge some of these partisan divides. There's some evidence that some of this is happening, but there needs to be much more, for sure.
Stephen Macedo, thank you so much for taking us through the political X-ray that COVID-19 wake provides. It's a rare gift to talk to someone with expertise. And thank you to my listeners. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we will see you in the next episode.
Thank you.